the whisper of the tide. The wind howled across the Virginia shore, carrying the salt of the Atlantic and the weight of unspoken sins.
Oh.
In the twilight of 1712, where the James River kissed the edge of a fledgling colony, a shadow lingered beneath the gnarled oaks. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the distant burn of tobacco fields, a land carved from dreams and desperation. Jamestown's wooden palisades stood defiant against the wilderness, but the true walls were built of hierarchy and fear. But a wild, untamed grace, like the ivy that clung to the estate's rotting fences. Her hair, black as a raven's wing, fell in waves she kept bound beneath a tattered kerchief. Whispers among the servants painted him as a man of mystery, a warrior from a kingdom called Ashanti, torn from his home in a raid and sold to the English. He had taken a particular interest in Eliza, his glances lingering too long, his voice dripping with menace when he spoke her name. That night, as Eliza returned to the kitchen house, Grayson was waiting. "You've been wandering, girl?" he sneered, his breath sour with rum. "Think you're too good for the fields with your half-breed blood?" He stepped closer, his hand grazing her arm, and Eliza's skin crawled. She pulled away, her heart pounding, but his laughter followed her into the dark. The other servants averted their eyes, knowing the cost of interference. Eliza fled to her pallet in the attic, her breath ragged, her mind a storm of fear and fury. She was no stranger to humiliation, but Grayson's touch was a new kind of violation, a reminder of her powerlessness. Yet as she lay in the dark, Kofi's words echoed. The river carries sorrow, not freedom. She wondered if he, too, knew the weight of being seen yet unseen, valued yet discarded. Some said he had led men in battle. Others claimed he bore scars from a rebellion crushed on a distant plantation. A traitor had arrived, a wiry man from the Carolinas, bringing news of unrest in the colony's, whispers of slaves slipping into the wilderness, of planters tightening their grip. With him came a proposition that sent a chill through the household, to secure peace with a nearby native tribe. The Powhatan, who had grown restless under English expansion, a marriage was proposed. The tribe's leader, a man known as Red Hawk, demanded a union to bind the uneasy truce. The planter's wife, Mistress Harrow, saw an opportunity to rid herself of Eliza, the living reminder of her husband's shame. "The girl will do," she declared, her voice cold as winter. "She's of no use here." Eliza stood frozen as the words sank in. She was to be given to a man she had never met, a pawn in a game of power. But the traitoress' next words struck like lightning. Red Hawk had offered a slave of his own to seal the bond, a man he claimed was of no value. It was Kofi. To Eliza, he was an enigma, a man who carried himself with a dignity the whip could not strip away. Their paths crossed again that evening, near the riverbank, where Eliza often stole moments to breathe away from the estate's suffocating air. Kofi was there, washing the day's grime from his hands, the water catching the last light of the sun. "Why do you linger here?" he asked, not turning to face her. "The river carries sorrow, not freedom." His words cut, not cruelly, but with a truth that made her chest ache. She wanted to retort, to shield herself with silence, but instead she said, "It's the only place I'm not invisible." He turned then, his gaze locking with hers, and in that moment, something shifted in unspoken understanding, fragile as a candle's flame. Her eyes, gray as the river's mist, saw too much every slight, every stolen glance, every whip that cracked in the distance. She was 22, and her life had been a litany of small humiliations, the overseer's leering, the mistress's sharp tongue, the whispers of Batardi that followed her like a shadow. Yet within her burned a defiance she could not name, spark kindled by the stories her mother once whispered of, a people who danced under stars, free from chains. Eliza clung to those tales, though they felt like ghosts themselves, fading with each passing year. Tobacco fields stretched endlessly, their leaves curling under the brutal sun, tended by hands calloused and chained. She looked up, expecting the overseer's scowl, but instead met the gaze of a stranger. He was tall, his skin the deep hue of polished ebony, his frame broad but worn, as if carved from hardship. His name, she would later learn, was Kofi. A man brought in chains from a land across the sea, now bound to the Harrow estate. His eyes held a quiet storm, a depth that seemed to see through her, past the kerchief and the dirt to the heart she guarded so fiercely. He carried a bundle of firewood, but his posture was not that of a broken man. There was a pride in his shoulders, a king's bearing beneath the rags. "You work the earth as if it speaks to you," he said, his voice low, accented with a cadence Eliza had never heard. She stiffened, unused to kindness, and muttered, "It's just dirt." But his words lingered, a spark in the monotony of her days. The air was heavy with the musk of labor and the faint tang of rebellion, whispered in stolen moments beneath the overseer's gaze. Mansions of brick and timber loomed over shanties, where the cries of the enslaved mingled with the laughter of children born to privilege. The James River, sluggish and silver under the dawn, carried the dreams of the free and the despair of the bound, its waters indifferent to both. In this world of contrasts, Eliza moved like a specter, her presence barely acknowledged. Her father, Thomas Harrow, once a planter of modest renown, had fallen to ruin after a scandal involving debts and a forbidden liaison with a native woman. Eliza, the product of that union, was neither white enough for the parlor nor dark enough for the fields. She was a half-breed, a living stain on her father's name, relegated to the edges of his crumbling estate. Her days were spent tending the herb garden behind the kitchen house. Her fingers stained green, her heart a silent furnace of rage and yearning. The other servants, a mix of African slaves and indentured souls, eyed her with pity or suspicion, for she belonged to neither their world nor the one above. Here, in this raw and restless frontier, the whispers of the tide told tales of those who dared to defy their chains. Among them was a woman, her name lost to the clamor of history, known only as Eliza, the forgotten daughter of a disgraced planter. Her eyes, the color of storm clouds, held a fire no lash could extinguish. Born to a mother who died in shame and a father who cast her aside, Eliza was neither servant nor free, neither cherished nor wholly scorned. She was a ghost in her own life, moving through the margins of a world that refused to claim her. The colony buzzed with the rhythm of survival slaves toiling under the sun, planters scheming for wealth, and the ever-present threat of rebellion simmering beneath the surface. Yet, in the quiet of dusk, as the river murmured secrets, something stirred in Eliza's heart, a longing, sharp as a blade, for a life beyond the shadows. The weight of the soil, the Virginia colony of 1712, sprawled like a wound across the earth, its heart pulsing with the sweat of those who tilled it. Eliza's beauty was a quiet thing, not the porcelain perfection of the planter's daughters, one sweltering afternoon. As the sun bled gold across the fields, Eliza knelt in the garden, her hands deep in the soil, when a shadow fell over her. Kofi was no ordinary slave, but the colony was no place for such connections. The overseer, a man named Grayson, had eyes like a hawk, and his cruelty was a legend among the enslaved. The next morning, a commotion broke the estate's rhythm. Eliza's heart lurched. Kofi, the man whose eyes had seen her, was to be her husband, not by choice, but by the cruel whims of those who owned them both. She stole a glance at him across the yard, where he stood head high, his face unreadable. Did he know? Did he care? Servants whispered of his past, of a betrayal that had cost him his freedom, but none spoke of his heart. His rags did little to hide the strength in his frame, the scars that crisscrossed his back like a map of suffering. The other slaves spoke of him in hushed tones, their words a blend of awe and fear. He stood tall, his eyes meeting Taman's without flinching, a silent challenge that made the air crackle. The air was thick with the scent of pine and the hum of cicadas, a chorus that seemed to mourn and celebrate in equal measure. The Powhatan departed into the dusk, their silhouettes swallowed by the forest, while the Harrows retreated to their mansion, their faces tight with disdain. Eliza and Kofi were left alone by the river, bound by words and chains, strangers yet now tied by fate. "You are not what they think," Kofi said at last, his voice low, the words almost lost to the river's murmur. Eliza turned to him, her heart a tangle of fear and defiance. "And what am I, then?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. He did not answer, but his gaze held hers, steady and unyielding, as if he saw the woman she had buried beneath years of shame. The night closed around them, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. Somewhere in the distance, a whip cracked, and Eliza flinched, the sound a reminder of the world they could not escape. Yet in Kofi's silence, she sensed a strength that mirrored her own, a fire that had not been quenched by chains or scorn. Could this man, this warrior stripped of his crown, be the key to her own salvation? Or would their union be another cage, forged by the hands of those who owned them? The Powhatan stood on one side, their faces unreadable, while the Harrows and their retainers formed a tense line opposite. Kofi waited at the center, his expression carved from stone, his hands clasped before him. Eliza's heart pounded as she approached, her gown catching on the uneven ground. The river gleamed behind them, its surface a mirror for the dying light. Taman spoke first, his words a blend of English and his own tongue, invoking spirits and ancestors Eliza could not name. The English minister, a dour man with a Bible clutched like a weapon, muttered prayers that felt hollow in the face of such raw, primal ritual. The vows were simple, spoken in two languages, binding Eliza and Kofi in a union neither had chosen. When Kofi took her hand, his touch was firm but gentle, his skin warm against hers. For a moment, their eyes met, and Eliza saw something flicker in his gaze, anger, perhaps, or sorrow, but also a spark of something else, something that made her breath hitch. Eliza's breath caught as she saw him up close for the first time since their meeting by the river. His face was a mask, but his eyes dark. Fathomless held a storm she could not read. Did he resent this marriage, this forced union with a woman he barely knew? Or did he, like her, feel the stirrings of something deeper, something that defied the cruelty of their world? The ceremony was to take place at dusk, on neutral ground by the river, where the English and Powhatan could stand without bloodshed. Until then, Eliza was confined to the kitchen house. Her every move watched by Grayson, the overseer, whose leering had grown bolder since the marriage was announced. A savage's bride, he taunted, his breath hot against her ear as he passed. Not a slave's at that. You'll learn your place soon enough. Liza's hands shook, but she held her tongue, her fire banked but not extinguished. She would not give him the satisfaction of her fear. He was Ashanti, they said, a warrior who had once led men under a sky untainted by English greed. But the sea had swallowed his freedom, and now he was Red Hawk's offering, a man deemed worthless yet chosen to bind a truce. Lisa watched him from afar, her heart a drumbeat of questions. What had he seen in her by the river? Why had his words so few and simple, lodged in her soul like thorns? She had no time to dwell, for Mistress Harrow's voice cut through the morning, sharp as a lash. Eliza, come. You'll not shame us before the savages. The word dripped with venom, and Eliza's blood burned, but she obeyed, her steps heavy as she crossed the yard.
Out.
The mistress's eyes, cold as frost, raked over her. Clean yourself. Go. You'll not go to your husband looking like a field hand. The word husband felt like a stone in Eliza's throat, foreign and unyielding. Eliza felt the weight of the soil beneath her feet, the earth she had tended all her life, now pulling her toward a fate she could not escape. Eliza was scrubbed raw, her hair bound tightly, her body draped in a simple gown of coarse linen, the closest thing to finery the Harrows would spare. The other servants avoided her gaze, their silence louder than words. Only one, an old woman named Mavis, dared to touch her hand, her fingers trembling as she whispered, "Keep your fire, child. It's all you've got." Mavis had been on the estate since before Eliza's birth, her own story one of stolen shores and broken songs. Her words were a lifeline, but they could not shield Eliza from the truth. She was being traded, half-breed pawn to appease a native chief and secure a fragile peace. The envoy arrived at noon, a trio of Powhatan men, their faces painted with ochre, their eyes sharp with distrust. Red Hawk was not among them, but his will was clear in their stance, their hands resting lightly on knives tucked into their belts. The leader, a man named Taman, spoke in halting English, his voice like gravel. The woman for the man. It is agreed. His gaze lingered on Eliza, not with lust, but with a cold assessment, as if weighing her worth against the price of peace. Yet, in the depths of her fear, a spark flickered, dangerous, reckless hope that this marriage, born of chains, might hold something more. The river's whisper grew louder, promising neither freedom nor sorrow, but something unnameable, waiting in the shadows. The chains of promise. The Virginia dawn broke with a cruel clarity, painting the sky in hues of blood and gold, as if the heavens themselves mocked the fragility of hope. The Harrow estate buzzed with a feverish energy, the air thick with the scent of tobacco smoke and the sharp tang of fear. Servants moved swiftly, their heads bowed, while the planter's family prepared for the arrival of Red Hawk's envoy. The marriage was no mere transaction. It was a delicate thread woven into the tapestry of survival. A bid to keep the Powhatan at bay, while the English tightened their grip on this wild, untamed land. The James River flowed on, its waters gleaming like a blade, indifferent to the lives it cradled or drowned. Eliza stood at the edge of the estate, her hands clenched, her storm-gray eyes fixed on the horizon. The weight of her fate pressed against her chest, heavy as the chains she had never worn, but always felt. She was to be wed to Kofi, a man whose very presence stirred something within her, a dangerous mix of curiosity and dread. He was a stranger, yet his gaze had already pierced the veil she wore to shield her heart. Did he know the secrets she carried, the shame of her birth, the whispers of her mother's blood that marked her as other? Or was he, too, a prisoner of secrets, bound by a past that refused to release him? Kofi stood apart, near the stables, his silhouette stark against the rising sun. The preparations were swift and merciless. Kofi was brought forward, his wrists unbound, but his pride a chain of its own. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the estate, Eliza was led to the riverbank. The ceremony ended abruptly, the tension unbroken. The shadow of secrets. The Virginia night draped itself over the riverbank like a mourner's veil, the stars above hidden by a shroud of clouds that promised rain. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of wet earth and the faint acrid bite of tobacco lingering from the fields. She glanced at Kofi, who stood with his back to the river, his gaze fixed on the dark line of trees beyond. It was a mean dwelling, unfit for the rats that scurried in the corners, but it was theirs a cage within a cage. Inside, the air was stale, the single pallet barely wide enough for one, let alone two. The other servants whispered, their glances a mix of pity and curiosity. For the marriage was a scandal, a half-breed and a slave bound in a union that defied the colony's rigid lines. The Harrows, too, watched closely. Mistress Harrows disdained a constant blade, her husband's silence a heavier weight. He spoke of a land called Ashanti, of a village where drums sang the history of his people, of a raid that had torn him from his family and cast him into the belly of a ship. The Powhatan, too, were restless, their truce with the English fraying as rumors of raids spread through the colony. Eliza felt the tension like a storm gathering, its thunder echoing in the glances she shared with Kofi, in the secrets they had begun to share. She did not know if he was her ally or her cage, but she knew one thing. The river still whispered, and its song was growing louder, calling her toward a reckoning she could not yet see. He did not speak of the scars on his back, but Eliza saw them in her mind, each one a chapter of loss. "And you?" he asked, turning the question on her. "What do you carry?" Eliza hesitated, her throat tight with the weight of her own secrets. She spoke of her mother, a Powhatan woman who had loved a man she could not keep, of a childhood spent in the shadows of her father's shame, of the name Batardi that had branded her heart. Kofi listened, his silence a gift, and when she finished, he said, "We are not what they name us." The words were a spark, igniting something within her resolve to be more than the sum of her pain. Thomas Harrow, Eliza's father, had not spoken to her since the ceremony, his eyes averted as if she were a ghost he could not face. Yet, in the quiet moments, Eliza and Kofi began to learn each other, not through words, but through glances, gestures, the small acts of defiance that marked their days. He brought her water when the sun was fiercest. She left him a sprig of lavender. It sent a fleeting gift. These were not acts of love, but of understanding, a recognition of shared wounds in a world that sought to break them. Eliza stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her heart a knot of resistance. "What are they?" she asked, her curiosity overcoming her caution. He looked up, his expression guarded, then softened. "Marks of my people," he said. "They speak of home, of strength, of the gods who watch even when we fall." Eliza knelt beside him, her fingers hovering over the intricate lines. "Do they watch us now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Kofi's gaze met hers, and for the first time, she saw not just strength, but sorrow, a man who carried a kingdom in his heart. "They watch," he said, "but they do not save." The words were a confession, And Eliza felt a pang of kinship, for she, too, had prayed to gods who seemed deaf to her pleas. She wanted to ask more, to unravel the story of the man before her. But a shout from the estate shattered the moment. Grayson's voice, calling for Kofi, his tone laced with menace. Kofi entered without a word, setting down a bundle of blankets he had been given, his movements deliberate, as if each step were a choice to endure. "This is no home," Eliza said, her voice barely above a whisper, the words more for herself than for him. Kofi paused, his back to her, and then turned, his expression unreadable. "A home is not walls," he said. "It is what you carry." His words struck her like a stone, stirring memories of her mother's voice, of stories told under starlight about a land where the earth sang to those who listened. Eliza wanted to ask what he carried, what memories or dreams sustained him, but the weight of Grayson's earlier threats still lingered, a poison in her blood. His hands, strong and scarred, hung loose at his sides, but there was a tension in his shoulders, a readiness that spoke of battles fought and lost. His presence was a constant threat, his cruelty a blade held over the necks of all who toiled under his watch. That morning, as Eliza had prepared for the ceremony, he had cornered her in the kitchen house. His hand gripping her wrist, his voice a hiss of menace. "You think this marriage makes you safe, girl?" Ed sneered, his breath sour with rum and malice. "You're still nothing. And that savage you're wed to is less than that." Eliza had pulled free, her skin burning where he touched her. But his laughter had followed her, a reminder of her vulnerability. Now, in the dim light of the cabin, she felt that vulnerability anew, magnified by the stranger who was now her husband. Kofi seemed to sense her unease, for he kept his distance, sitting on the edge of the pallet, his hands clasped as if in prayer. "He will not touch you," he said, his voice steady, though his eyes burned with a quiet fury. Eliza met his gaze, surprised by the conviction in his words. "You cannot promise that," she said, her voice trembling despite her resolve. Kofi's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more, and the silence that followed was a fragile truce. "Da da 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 da," he said at last, his voice low, carrying the weight of a truth too heavy for the fragile night. "Da da 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 da," her fingers tightening into fists. "Nor were we before," she replied, her voice sharp with the edge of her own defiance. "What difference does this vow make?" Kofi turned to her, then his eyes catching the faint light, and for a moment she saw not a slave, but a man who had once commanded respect, a man whose spirit had not bowed to the whip. "It makes us dangerous," he said, and the words sent a shiver through her, not of fear but of recognition. Dangerous to whom? To the Harrows? To the Powhatan? To each other? She did not ask, for the answer lay in the silence between them, heavy with possibilities neither could yet name. The James River whispered its ceaseless song, its waters lapping at the shore, as if urging Eliza and Kofi to flee or to stand firm, though neither knew which. They stood apart, two figures bound by a vow that felt like a chain, their silhouettes etched against the fading glow of the ceremony's torches. Eliza's heart thudded in her chest, a rhythm that matched the river's pulse, her mind a storm of questions and fears. Kofi, her husband by decree, was a stranger whose presence stirred both dread and a strange unbidden hope. His silence was a fortress, his eyes a locked gate, and yet she sensed within him a story as deep and wounded as her own. The estate loomed in the distance, its lights flickering like the eyes of a predator, reminding them that freedom was a word they could not yet claim. The marriage, meant to seal peace between the English and the Powhatan, had instead cast them into a new kind of captivity, one woven from distrust and unspoken truths. Eliza's gown clung to her skin, damped from the evening's humidity, its coarse fabric a mockery of the finery worn by the planters' daughters. They were given a small cabin on the edge of the estate, a crumbling structure once used for storage, its walls patched with mud and its roof leaking secrets to the sky. Grayson, the overseer, was a shadow that refused to fade. The days that followed were a dance of survival. Eliza and Kofi moved through their roles, her in the herb garden, him in the field, sunder the watchful eyes of the estate. One evening, as the sky burned crimson, Eliza found Kofi by the river, his hands tracing patterns in the dirt, symbols she did not recognize. That night, in the cabin, Kofi revealed a fragment of his past, his voice low, as if the walls might betray him. But the world outside their cabin was relentless. Grayson's threats grew bolder, his eyes following Eliza with a hunger that made her skin crawl. The spark in the dark. The Virginia summer of 1712 clung to the land like a fever. Its heat a relentless fist that squeezed the breath from both the free and the bound. The tobacco fields shimmered under a merciless sun, their leaves curling as if in surrender, while the James River flowed sluggish and sullen, its waters reflecting a sky bruised with the promise of storms. The overseer seemed to sense the strength beneath Kofi's silence, the pride that refused to break, and he sought to crush it. The truce was holding. But the chief demanded a meeting to ensure its strength, a gathering on neutral ground, where Eliza and Kofi would stand as symbols of the uneasy alliance. The Powhatan stood in a semicircle, their faces painted with ochre and ash, their weapons sheathed, but ever present. Red Hawk was there this time, a man of middle years with eyes like flint, his presence commanding despite his simple attire. A slave, a young man named Jonah, had vanished in the night, leaving behind only a broken chain and whispers of the forest. The Harrows were furious, Grayson's rage a storm that lashed out at all who crossed his path. Eliza and Kofi were watched more closely, their every move scrutinized, for the estate buzzed with fear of rebellion. In the herb garden, Eliza overheard Mavis speaking to another servant, her voice low and urgent. "Jonah's not the first," she said. "There's a path through the swamp, to a place where the chains don't reach." Eliza's heart raced at the words, her mind turning to Kofi, to the symbols he drew, to the fire in his eyes. Was he part of this? Did he know the path Mavis spoke of? She wanted to ask, but fear held her back, for trust was a fragile thing, and betrayal was a shadow that never slept. Yet, as she looked at Kofi across the fields, his figure strong against the horizon, she felt the spark within her grow, flame that whispered of freedom, of a life beyond the chains that bound them both. The Harrows stood opposite, flanked by armed retainers, their wealth a shield against the wilderness they sought to tame. Eliza and Kofi stood between them, exposed, their marriage a fragile bridge over a chasm of distrust. Red Hawk's gaze lingered on Kofi, a flicker of recognition passing between them, though neither spoke of it. "The bond holds," Red Hawk said, his voice carrying over the river's murmur. "But the land grows restless. There are whispers of rebellion, of slaves who flee to the forests." His eyes shifted to Eliza, sharp and searching, as if he saw the fire she hid. "You were of two worlds, woman. Where does your heart lie?" The question struck like a blade, and Eliza felt Kofi's hand brush hers, a silent urging to stand tall. "My heart lies with survival," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that clawed at her chest. Red Hawk's lips twitched, not quite a smile, but he nodded, and the tension eased, if only for a moment. The Harrows agreed, their faces tight with reluctance, for the Powhatan's presence was a reminder of how fragile their control truly was. The servants spoke of Red Hawk's words, of the unrest that simmered beyond the palisades. Grayson's mood grew darker, his cruelty sharper, as if he sensed a shift in the air. That night he came to the cabin, his shadow filling the doorway, his voice a low growl. "You think you're safe now, girl? With your savage husband and your heathen friends?" He stepped closer, his hand reaching for her, but Kofi was there, a wall of strength between them. "Touch her, and you will answer to me," Kofi said, his voice calm but laced with steel. Grayson laughed, a sound like breaking glass, but he retreated, his eyes promising retribution. Eliza's heart pounded, her gratitude for Kofi warring with the fear of what his defiance would cost them. In the silence that followed, Kofi turned to her, his expression soft for the first time. "We are not their playthings," he said. "Not anymore." The words were a vow, and Eliza felt the spark within her flare into a flame, bright and dangerous. The meeting was set for the following dusk, by the river,
Ow!
where the air was thick with the scent of pine and the ghosts of old battles.
Ow!
Eliza felt a chill as she prepared, her hands trembling as she tied her kerchief. Kofi stood beside her, his presence a steady anchor, but his eyes were distant, as if he saw a future she could not. "They will test us," he said, his voice a low rumble. "They always do." Eliza wanted to ask what he meant, but the weight of his words silenced her. She felt the eyes of the estate upon them, the Harrow's disdain, Grayson's malice, the servant's pity, all pressing against her like a storm. He assigned Kofi the hardest tasks, hauling logs under the midday sun, clearing brush in the swampy outskirts where mosquitoes swarmed like a plague. Yet Kofi endured, his movements steady, his eyes burning with a fire that no lash could extinguish. Eliza watched him from the garden, her heart torn between admiration and fear. She saw the scars on his back when he bent to lift a load, the marks of a past that spoke of rebellion and loss. At night, in their cramped cabin, they spoke little, but their silence was no longer cold. It was a language of its own, woven from shared glances and the brush of hands as they passed each other in the dark. One night, as thunder rumbled in the distance, Kofi traced the same strange symbols in the dirt floor of the cabin, his fingers moving with reverence. "These are for protection," he said, his voice low, as if the walls might betray them. "For us." Eliza knelt beside him, her fingers hovering over the lines, and for the first time she felt a spark of trust, fragile but fierce. The Harrow estate stood as a monument to ambition and decay, its brick walls masking the rot within greed, cruelty, and secrets that festered like wounds. Eliza moved through this world with a quiet ferocity, her hands stained with the earth of the herb garden, her heart a crucible where fear and defiance battled for dominance. Kofi, her husband, by force of a cruel bargain, was both a stranger and a mirror, his presence a constant reminder of the chains they shared and the fire they hid. Their marriage, a fragile thread woven to appease the Powhatan and secure the Harrow's fragile peace, had become something else, a pact of survival, a silent vow to endure. Yet the world around them was a tinderbox, and Eliza felt the spark of something dangerous growing within her, kindled by Kofi's words and the weight of his gaze. Each day brought new trials. Grayson, the overseer, was a specter that haunted Eliza's steps, his leering gaze a blade held too close to her skin. His cruelty was not random, but calculated, a reminder to all who toiled under his whip that power belonged to him alone. He took particular pleasure in tormenting Eliza, his taunts laced with venom. A half-breed bride for a savage, he spat one morning as she passed with a basket of herbs, his hand brushing her arm with deliberate intent. "You think that slave can protect you?" Eliza's blood boiled, but she held her tongue, her eyes flashing with a defiance she could not voice. Kofi, working in the fields nearby, saw the exchange, his jaw tightening, his hands gripping the hoe as if it were a weapon. She felt his gaze like a shield, but it was not enough to dull the sting of Grayson's words or the fear that coiled in her gut. The other servants, bound by their own chains, offered no comfort, their eyes averted as if her suffering were contagious. Only Mavis, the old woman who had known Eliza's mother, dared to speak. "Watch yourself, child," she whispered one evening, her voice rough with worry. "Grayson's got a hunger that don't sleep." Kofi, too, bore the weight of Grayson's cruelty. That spark was tested when the Powhatan returned. A week after the marriage, Timon envoy appeared at the estate with a message from Red Hawk. The meeting was a tense affair, the riverbank a stage where power and pride collided. The return to the estate was a march through a gauntlet of whispers. The next morning, a discovery shook the estate. The whisper of rebellion. The Virginia dawn of 1712 broke with a restless hush, as if the land itself held its breath, wary of the secrets it harbored. The James River gleamed like molten silver, its surface rippling with the weight of unspoken truths. While the tobacco fields stretched endlessly, their leaves heavy with dew and the sweat of those who tended them. The Harrow estate stood as a fortress of order amid the chaos of the frontier, its brick walls a facade masking the cracks of fear and greed within. He worked the fields with a steady rhythm, his scars a testament to battles fought and endured, his silence a shield against the world's cruelty. Yet in the stolen moments by the river, where the cicadas sang and the water whispered, he revealed fragments of himself. Another slave, a woman named Sarah, had collapsed under the sun, her body worn thin by labor and hunger. "They will come for us," he said, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the door. Grayson was given free rein, his cruelty a blunt instrument to quell any hint of rebellion. He singled out Kofi, assigning him to clear a new field in the swamp, a task meant to break him. Eliza watched, her heart in her throat, as Kofi marched into the wilderness, his figure swallowed by the mist. She wanted to follow, to stand beside him, but Grayson's eyes were on her, his smile a promise of retribution. That evening, when Kofi returned, his clothes torn and his skin slick with sweat, Eliza saw the toll of the day in his eyes, but also a fire that refused to die. "They cannot take what we do not give," he said, his voice hoarse but resolute. Eliza nodded, her own resolve hardening, and in that moment, they were no longer just husband and wife, they were allies, bound by a shared dream of freedom, however distant it seemed. The English, the Powhatan, both seek to own us. Eliza overheard fragments of plans, of meetings in the swamp, of signals hidden in songs. She saw Kofi's gaze linger on the horizon, his hands tracing symbols in the dirt, and she knew he was part of it, though he did not speak the words. Her own heart was torn between the safety of silence and the call of the unknown, between the fear of betrayal and the hope of a new beginning. The river's song grew louder, its whisper a siren's call, promising a path through the darkness. But the path was not clear, and the price of freedom was a debt neither Eliza nor Kofi could yet measure. Eliza felt a chill, for she knew he spoke the truth. The marriage that bound them was a fragile shield, and the world outside was a storm waiting to break. "And what do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling with the weight of her fear and her hope. Kofi turned to her, his gaze steady, his hand reaching for hers. "We choose," he said, "to fight, to flee, to live." His touch was warm, grounding, and for the first time, Eliza felt the spark within her flare into a blaze, a resolve to defy the chains that bound them. But the path ahead was fraught with peril, and the secrets they carried were a heavy burden. Mavis's words echoed in her mind. The river splits, and Eliza wondered if Kofi knew the way. If he was already planning a journey she could not yet see. Grayson's whip was swift, his shouts a storm of fury. But the other slaves stood still, their eyes burning with a defiance that chilled the air. Kofi was among them, his stance unyielding, his hands clenched as if ready to strike. Eliza, watching from the garden, felt her heart lurch, for she knew the cost of such resistance. Grayson's eyes found Kofi, and a cruel smile twisted his lips. "You think you're a king, don't you?" he sneered, raising his whip. But before the lash could fall, a shout from the estate's gate stopped him a rider, dust-covered and breathless, bearing news of unrest. The Powhatan had raided a neighboring plantation, burning fields and freeing slaves, a warning to the English that the truce was fraying. The Harrows summoned Grayson, and the moment passed, but the air crackled with the promise of violence. One evening, as the sky burned orange, he spoke of his homeland, of a kingdom where the sun crowned the earth in gold, where drums sang the stories of ancestors. "I was a warrior," he said, his voice low, his hands tracing the symbols of his people in the dirt. "But the sea stole my name, my crown, my kin." Eliza listened, her heart aching with the weight of his loss, for she knew the pain of being torn from one's roots. "And now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Kofi's eyes met hers, dark and fathomless. "Now I am what I choose to be," he said, and the words were a spark, igniting the fire within her that had long been banked. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the faint, bitter tang of smoke, a reminder of the fires that burned in the hearts of the enslaved. Mavis, the old woman who had known Elisa's mother, was a quiet conduit of secrets, her words careful but heavy with meaning. "There's a place," she told Eliza one night, her voice low as they sat in the kitchen house, the fire casting shadows on the walls, beyond the swamp where the river splits. "The free ones gather there, black and red, bound by no master." Eliza's breath caught, her mind racing with images of a life unbound, but fear coiled in her gut. To flee was to risk everything: capture, torture, death. Yet the thought of staying, of enduring Grayson's leers and the Harrow's disdain, was a slow death of its own. She looked to Kofi, who sat sharpening a hoe by the fire, his movements deliberate, his face unreadable. Did he know of this place? Was he part of the whispers that haunted the estate? She wanted to ask, but trust was a fragile thing, and the weight of their shared secrets held her tongue. Eliza moved through this world like a shadow cast by a dying flame, her hands calloused from the herb garden, her storm-gray eyes sharp with a vigilance born of survival. Kofi, her husband by the cruel decree of a colonial bargain, was both her anchor and her enigma, his presence a quiet storm that stirred her soul. Their marriage, meant to bind the English and the Powhatan, had instead woven them into a tapestry of defiance. Their shared glances and silences, a language of resistance in a world that sought to break them. The estate buzzed with tension in the wake of Jonah's escape. The servants whispered of paths through the swamp, of hidden camps where the free and the fugitive mingled under the cover of night. Grayson, the overseer, was a tempest of rage. His whip cracking with renewed ferocity, his eyes searching for any sign of rebellion. He prowled the fields like a wolf, his gaze lingering on Eliza and Kofi, as if he sensed the spark that burned between them. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he snarled one morning, catching Eliza alone as she carried water from the well. His hand shot out, gripping her arm, his fingers digging into her skin. "Your savage husband won't save you when the noose comes." Eliza's heart pounded, but she met his gaze, her voice steady despite the fear that clawed at her. "The noose comes for us all, Grayson," she said, wrenching free. His laughter followed her, sharp and cruel. But she felt Kofi's eyes on her from across the yard, a silent promise that she was not alone. Kofi bore the weight of Grayson's malice with a quiet strength that both awed and unsettled Eliza. That fire grew in the days that followed, fed by whispers of rebellion that spread like wildfire through the estate. The tension broke one sweltering afternoon when a cry rang out from the fields. That night in their cabin, Kofi spoke of the rebellion, his voice a low rumble that seemed to shake the walls. The next morning, a new threat emerged. The Harrows, shaken by the news of the raid, tightened their grip on the estate. As the days passed, the whispers of rebellion grew louder, a chorus that could not be silenced. The path through the swamp. The Virginia twilight of 1712 was a shroud woven from heat and shadow, cloaking the Harrow estate in a restless hush that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the land. The James River, swollen from recent rains, churned with a restless energy, its waters catching the last embers of a sun that bled crimson across the horizon. The tobacco fields, heavy with the scent of earth and toil, stood silent, their leaves trembling in the evening breeze, as if whispering secrets too dangerous to speak aloud. Kofi spoke little of his plans, but his actions spoke volumes. Each night, he traced the symbols of his people in the dirt floor, his fingers moving with a reverence that made Eliza's heart ache. Another slave, a man named Caleb, had been caught hiding food, a small act of defiance that Grayson seized upon like a predator. The Harrows, shaken by the growing unrest, summoned a militia from Jamestown, their muskets gleaming in the sun as they patrolled the estate. The air was thick with the scent of gunpowder and fear, the servants moving with bowed heads, their whispers silenced by the threat of steel. The swamp was treacherous, but it was also a shield, its shadows a refuge for those who dared to dream of freedom. Eliza thought of her mother, of the stories she had told of a people who danced under the stars, and she felt a spark of hope, fragile but fierce. The river's song grew louder, its whisper a call to courage, to a path that led through the darkness to a place where chains could not reach. But the path was fraught with peril, and the price of rebellion was a debt they might pay in blood. Grayson's power grew, his cruelty unchecked, and he turned his attention to Eliza and Kofi with a vengeance. "You're trouble, both of you," he snarled one evening, his shadow filling the cabin's doorway. "I'll see you broken before this is done." Kofi stepped forward, his body a shield, his voice calm but deadly. "We'll try," he said, and the words were a challenge that made Grayson's eyes narrow. He retreated, but his parting glance was a promise of violence, a storm that would not be long in coming. The whip fell swift and brutal, Caleb's cries echoing across the estate, a warning to all who dreamed of resistance. Eliza watched from the garden, her hands clenched, her heart a storm of rage and helplessness. Kofi stood among the others, his eyes burning with a fury that made the air crackle. For a moment, Eliza thought he would act, that he would strike Grayson down and damn the consequences. But he held back his restraint, a testament to a strength she could only imagine. That night, in their cabin, he spoke of the rebellion in hushed tones, his voice a low fire that warmed the cold dark. "They're gathering," he said, his eyes fixed on hers. "In the swamp, where the river splits, they wait for a sign." Liza's heart raced, her mind torn between fear and hope. "And you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Are you their sign?" Kofi's gaze softened, but he did not answer, and the silence was a weight she could not bear. "These are for courage," he said one evening, his voice a low rumble as thunder growled in the distance. "For the path ahead." Eliza knelt beside him, her fingers hovering over the intricate lines, her mind racing with questions she dared not ask. "There is a meeting," he said, his eyes searching hers. "Tomorrow, at the river's split. They need us, Eliza. Your blood, your mother's peoplet, could sway the Powhatan to join us." Eliza's heart lurched, for she had spent her life hiding her mother's heritage, the Powhatan blood that marked her as other. To use it now, to step into that world, was to risk everything: her safety, her secrets, her heart. "And if they reject me?" she asked, her voice breaking. Kofi's hand found hers, his touch warm and steady. "Then we fight alone," he said, "but we fight." The words were a vow, and Eliza felt the fire within her blaze, a flame that could light the way or consume them both. She nodded, her resolve hardening, and in that moment, they were no longer just allies. They were partners in a rebellion that could remake their world or destroy it. Did he know of the place Mavis had spoken of, the hidden camp beyond the swamp where the free gathered? Was he planning to flee, to fight, to risk everything for a dream that might end in blood? She wanted to ask, but fear held her back, for trust was a fragile bridge, and the weight of their secrets could shatter it. Yet, in his eyes, she saw a fire that mirrored her own, a resolve that whispered of freedom, however distant it seemed. The estate itself was a fortress of tension, its brick walls and flickering lanterns, a thin veneer over the chaos that simmered beneath. Mavis, the old woman who had known Eliza's mother, was a quiet weaver of secrets, her words careful but heavy with meaning. One evening, as they sat by the kitchen fire, she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "The river splits at the old oak, child," she said, her eyes darting to the door. "Follow it north, through the swamp. That's where they go, the ones who break their chains." Eliza's breath caught, her heart pounding with the weight of the knowledge. The swamp was a place of dread, its waters thick with mud and snakes, its shadows alive with the ghosts of those who had tried and failed to escape. But it was also a path to freedom, a narrow thread through a world of chains. She looked to Kofi, who sat sharpening a knife by the fire, his movements deliberate, his face a mask. Did he know? Was he already part of this hidden world, this rebellion that pulsed beneath the estate's surface? She wanted to ask, but the fear of betrayal was a shadow that never slept. Whispers of rebellion had grown into a low hum, a current that ran through the enslaved, the servants, and even the shadows that clung to the palisades. Eliza felt it in her bones, a tremor of possibility that both thrilled and terrified her. Her hands, stained with the green of the herb garden, trembled as she worked, her storm-gray eyes scanning the horizon for signs of the storm she knew was coming. Kofi, her husband by the cruel decree of a colonial pact, was a pillar of quiet strength beside her, his presence a lodestone in the maelstrom of their lives. Their marriage, born of necessity, had become a bond of shared defiance, a silent vow to carve a path through the chains that bound them. The estate was a cauldron of fear and suspicion. Grayson, the overseer, was a specter of malice, his whip a constant threat, his eyes a blade that sought to cut through any hint of resistance. Since Jonah's escape, his cruelty had sharpened, his gaze lingering on Kofi with a hatred that was almost personal. He seemed to sense the warrior beneath the slave, the king beneath the scars, and he sought to break him with tasks meant to grind his spirit to dust. Kofi endured, his movements steady, his silence a fortress. But Eliza saw the toll in the lines of his face, the way his hands clenched when Grayson's shadow fell across him. She, too, bore the weight of Grayson's menace. His taunts had grown bolder, his touches more brazen, each one a violation that stoked the fire in her chest. "You think that Savage can keep you safe?" he hissed one morning, cornering her near the kitchen house, his breath sour with rum and rage. Eliza's heart pounded, but she held his gaze, her voice low and sharp. "I keep myself safe," she said, pulling away, her defiance a spark that burned brighter with each insult. Grayson's laughter was a lash, but it could not extinguish the flame within her. In the quiet of their cabin, Eliza and Kofi found refuge in the silences they shared, a language built from glances and the brush of hands in the dark. The whispers of rebellion grew louder, a chorus that could not be silenced. The tension broke one sweltering afternoon when a cry rang out from the fields. The next morning, a new threat emerged. That night, Kofi revealed more of his plan, his voice a whisper as the rain began to fall, drumming against the cabin's roof. As the rain fell, Eliza and Kofi made their plans, their voices low, their hands tracing paths in the dirt. The river's reckoning. The Virginia night of 1712 wrapped the world in a cloak of shadow and rain, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and the restless hum of a land on the edge of upheaval. Kofi had spoken of it in whispers, his voice a low fire that warmed the cold walls of their cabin. The overseer's cruelty had become a storm, his whip a constant threat, his eyes a blade that sought to carve through Eliza's defiance. He seemed to sense the rebellion brewing. His malice focused on her and Kofi with a precision that chilled her blood. Eliza and Kofi prepared in silence, their movements swift and deliberate. The river's split was a mile north, a journey that felt like a lifetime, each step fraught with the threat of discovery or disaster. The woman who called herself Nia spoke of a rebellion that had been growing for months, a coalition of slaves. In the cabin, Kofi's eyes met hers, and for the first time he spoke of love not in words, but in the way his hand lingered on hers, in the way his gaze held her like a promise. "We are not what they name us," he said, echoing his words from nights past. And Eliza felt the fire within her blaze, a flame that could light the way or consume them both. The river's song was a roar now, a call to a reckoning that could not be delayed. But the path ahead was a blade's edge, and the price of freedom was a debt they might pay in blood. And natives who sought to carve a free land beyond the reach of the English— "Your marriage is a bridge," Nia said, her gaze shifting between Eliza and Kofi. "But bridges can burn." The words were a challenge, and Eliza felt Kofi's hand tighten on hers, his strength a silent vow. "We stand together," he said, his voice steady, and Eliza nodded, her fear giving way to a fire that burned brighter than ever. The gathering was brief, the plan's urgent signals to be sent, weapons to be gathered, strike to be planned against the militia before they could crush the rebellion. Eliza's role was clear. Her Powhatan blood could sway the tribes, could turn the tide. But the risk was immense. For to claim that heritage was to step into a world that might reject her as fiercely as the English had. Kofi moved with the grace of a warrior, his eyes scanning the shadows, his hand ready at his knife. Eliza followed, her gown catching on roots, her heart a drumbeat of resolve and terror. They spoke little, but their glances were a language of their own, a shared understanding that this path was their only hope. At last, they reached the old oak, its gnarled branches a sentinel over the river's fork. There, in the shadows, figures emerged, men and women, black and red, their faces marked with the scars of chains and the fire of defiance. A woman stepped forward, her skin dark as night, her eyes sharp with wisdom. "You are the half-breed," she said, her voice low but commanding. "And you," she turned to Kofi, "are the warrior who would be king." Kofi wrapped a knife in a cloth, tucking it into his waistband, while Eliza gathered what little they could carry, a small loaf of bread, a flask of water, the lavender from Mavis. The cabin felt smaller than ever, its walls closing in, as if to trap them. But Kofi's presence was a steady flame, his hand brushing hers as they stepped into the night. The estate was quiet, the militia's lanterns dim, their snores a faint reassurance that the moment was theirs. They slipped through the shadows, past the fields, toward the swamp's edge, where the river gleamed like a path of stars. Eliza's heart pounded, her breath shallow, for each step was a leap into the unknown. Kofi led the way, his steps sure, despite the darkness, his silence a guide through the maze of fear that gripped her. That morning, as she carried herbs to the kitchen house, he had blocked her path, his hand gripping her wrist with bruising force. "You're planning something, aren't you, girl?" he hissed, his breath hot against her cheek. "I'll break you both before you run." Eliza's heart pounded, but she held his gaze, her voice steady, despite the fear that clawed at her. "You break what you can't hold," she said, wrenching free, her defiance a flame that burned brighter with each threat. Grayson's laughter was a lash, but it could not extinguish the fire within her. She felt Kofi's eyes on her from the fields, his presence a shield, but she knew the cost of his protection would be steep. "Tomorrow," he had said, his eyes burning with a resolve that made Eliza's heart race. The militia patrolled with a heavy tread, their voices sharp with suspicion, while the Harrows watched from their mansion, their faces tight with fear of the unrest that simmered beyond their walls. The servants moved with bowed heads, their whispers silenced, but Eliza saw the spark in their eyes, the same fire that burned in Kofi's. Mavis, ever watchful, pulled Eliza aside at dusk, her voice a urgent whisper. "Be careful, child," she said, hands trembling as she pressed a small bundle into Eliza's hands. "A sprig of lavender, a talisman of protection. The swamp is no kind place, but it's the only way." Eliza nodded, her throat tight, for Mavis's words were a lifeline, a reminder of the mother she had lost and the strength she carried. She hid the lavender in her apron. It sent a faint comfort against the storm that loomed. "We go at midnight, when the militia sleep." The words were a vow, but they carried a weight that pressed against her chest. For the swamp was a labyrinth of peril mud that swallowed boots, snakes that struck without warning, and shadows that hid both friend and foe. Eliza's mind churned with the stories Mavis had told of the free ones who gathered where the river split. Black and red, united in defiance of the chains that bound them. Her Powhatan blood, long hidden beneath her father's shame, was a key to that world, a bridge to a people who might embrace or reject her. The thought filled her with both hope and dread, for to step into that identity was to risk everything: her safety, her secrets, her heart. The James River roared, swollen by days of relentless storms, its waters churning with secrets that refused to stay buried. The Harrow estate stood like a sentinel against the wilderness, its lanterns flickering like the last breaths of a dying hope. While the tobacco fields lay sodden and silent, their leaves battered by the deluge, the militia's presence had turned the estate into a prison, their muskets glinting in the torchlight, their eyes scanning for any sign of defiance. Eliza felt the weight of their gaze as she moved through her tasks, her hands trembling in the herb garden, her storm-gray eyes darting to the horizon where the swamp waited, a dark promise of freedom or death. Kofi, her husband, by the cruel hand of fate, was aflame in the darkness, his strength a beacon that both steadied and unnerved her. Their marriage, a fragile thread meant to bind empires, had woven them into a rebellion that pulsed like a heartbeat, its rhythm growing louder with each passing day. The plan to join the gathering at the river's split was a spark that could ignite a fire or consume them all. Grayson's shadow loomed larger with each passing hour. The day was a gauntlet of tension. As midnight approached, the rain slowed to a drizzle, the air thick with the hum of cicadas and the distant growl of thunder. The swamp was a living thing, its air heavy with the scent of decay and the buzz of insects, its ground sucking at their feet like a hungry beast. Eliza's breath caught, her Powhatan blood a weight she could no longer hide. As they returned to the estate before dawn, the rain began again, a cold curtain that hid their tracks but not their resolve. The fire of reckoning. The Virginia dawn of 1712 broke with a ferocity that mirrored the storm within the hearts of those who dared to dream of freedom. The James River, swollen and wild from days of rain, roared like a beast unchained, its waters churning with the weight of secrets that could no longer be contained. The Harrow estate stood as a monument to a fading order, its brick walls battered by the elements, its lanterns flickering like the last gasps of a dying empire. Grayson, the overseer, was a storm of malice, his whip a constant threat, his eyes a predator's gaze that sought to crush any hint of resistance. He seemed to sense the rebellion brewing, his cruelty focused on Eliza and Kofi with a vengeance that bordered on obsession. The servants moved with bowed heads, their whispers silenced, but Eliza saw the spark in their eyes, the same fire that burned in Kofi's. Mavis, ever watchful, pulled Eliza aside at dusk, her voice a urgent whisper. Nia was there, her eyes sharp with wisdom, her presence a steady anchor in the chaos. The rebels moved, their steps swift and silent, their weapons crude but deadly knives, hoes, stolen muskets. Eliza and Kofi joined them, their hearts a drumbeat of resolve, their eyes fixed on the path ahead. The plan was simple but perilous. Strike the militia's outpost at the estate's edge. Free the slaves held in the stockade, and flee to the hidden camp beyond the swamp. But as they neared the estate, a shout shattered the night. Grayson's voice, sharp and furious, followed by the crack of a musket. The militia was awake, their lanterns flaring, their shouts a storm that threatened to drown the rebellion before it could begin. Eliza's heart lurched, her hand gripping Kofi's, but his eyes were steady, his voice a low command. "We fight," he said, and the words were a spark that ignited the fire within her. "The signal," she said, her voice low but commanding. The rebels fought with a ferocity born of desperation, their crude weapons striking against the militia's muskets. Eliza moved through the fray, her knife flashing, her Powhatan blood a fire that guided her hand. Kofi was a warrior reborn, his movements swift and deadly, his scars a testament to a strength that could not be broken. They fought side by side, their bond a shield against the chaos, their love a flame that burned brighter with each blow. But the cost was heavy. Rebels fell, their cries echoing in the night, and Grayson's shadow loomed. His whip traded for a musket, his eyes fixed on Kofi with a hatred that burned like hellfire. "You," he roared, raising his weapon. But Eliza was there, her knife slashing, her voice a cry of defiance that cut through the storm. Grayson fell, his blood staining the earth, but the victory was fleeting. For the militia rallied, their numbers overwhelming. Kofi nodded, his hands steady as he struck flint against steel, a spark catching on the bundle of dry grass they had prepared. The rebels fled into the swamp, their path lit by the fire they had set, its smoke a shroud that hid their escape. But as they reached the river's split, Eliza felt a cold dread, for the Powhatan had not come. Her blood, her bridge, had not been enough. The rebels were alone, their numbers dwindling, their hope a fragile flame in the face of the storm. Kofi's hand found hers, his touch a lifeline, his eyes burning with a resolve that refused to break. "We are not done," he said, and Eliza nodded, her heart ablaze that could light the way or consume them both. The river's song was a roar now, a call to a reckoning that would not be denied. But the path ahead was a blade's edge, and the price of freedom was a debt they might pay with their lives. The fire flared, a beacon in the darkness, its light dancing across the water like a call to arms. The rebels watched, their breath held, as the flame grew, its smoke curling into the sky. Liza's heart raced, her Powhatan blood a pulse that echoed in her veins, urging her to step forward, to claim the heritage she had hidden for so long. "I will speak to them," she said, her voice steady, despite the fear that clawed at her. Nia's eyes softened, but she nodded, and Kofi's hand brushed hers, a silent vow of support. "The lavender," she said, her hands trembling as she pressed another sprig into Eliza's hands. "Keep it close, child. It'll guide you through the dark." Eliza nodded, her throat tight, for Mavis's words were a lifeline, a reminder of the mother she had lost and the strength she carried. She hid the lavender in her gown, it sent a faint comfort against the storm that loomed. That morning, as Eliza tended the herb garden, he approached, his shadow falling across her like a curse. Eliza and Kofi slipped from their cabin, their steps silent, their hearts pounding with the weight of their purpose. The swamp was a labyrinth of shadow and mud, its air thick with the scent of decay and the buzz of insects. Kofi led the way, his knife at his side, his eyes scanning the darkness for signs of pursuit. Eliza followed, her gown catching on roots, her breath shallow as fear and resolve battled within her. The river split was their destination, the old oak a beacon in the night, its branches a silent witness to the rebellion that was about to ignite. They moved swiftly, their silence a pact, their glances a vow that they would see this through or die trying. "You think you're clever, girl," he snarled, his hand grazing her arm, his breath hot with rum and rage. "You and that savage are plotting, aren't you? I'll see you both swing." Liza's heart pounded, but she met his gaze, her voice steady, despite the fear that clawed at her. "You see shadows where there are none," she said, her defiance, a spark that burned brighter with each threat. Grayson's hand tightened, but a shout from the fields, a militiaman calling for him, forced him to retreat, his parting glance a promise of retribution. The tobacco fields, sodden and trampled, lay silent under a sky bruised with clouds, their leaves a testament to the labor of those who toiled in chains. He worked the fields with a steady rhythm, his scars a silent testament to battles fought and endured, his eyes burning with a fire that no lash could extinguish. In the stolen moments by the river, where the cicadas sang and the water whispered, he spoke of the rebellion, his voice a low fire that warmed the cold dark. "Tonight," he said, his eyes fixed on hers, "we send the signal afire in the swamp to call the others." Liza's breath caught, her mind racing with the weight of what they were about to do. The signal would summon the rebels, black and red, to strike against the militia, to carve a path to freedom through the heart of the colony. But the cost was steep. Capture meant death, And betrayal was a shadow that never slept. "And the Powhatan?" she asked, her voice trembling with the weight of her heritage. Kofi's hand found hers, his touch warm and steady. "You are their bridge," he said. "They will listen, or we will make them." The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and the sharp temps of gunpowder. A reminder of the militia that patrolled the palisades, their muskets gleaming with the promise of violence. Eliza moved through this world like a flame caught in a gale, her hands stained with the earth of the herb garden, her storm-gray eyes burning with a resolve that had been forged in the crucible of rebellion. Kofi, her husband, by the cruel hand of fate, was a pillar of strength beside her, his scars a map of survival, his silence a sword that cut through the chaos. Their marriage, a fragile thread woven to appease empires, become a firebrand, a beacon that lit the path to a reckoning that could not be delayed. The meeting at the river's split had changed everything. Nia's words, "Your marriage is a bridge," but bridges can burn, echoed in Eliza's mind, a challenge that weighed heavy on her heart. Her Powhatan blood, long buried beneath the shame of her father's rejection, was now a weapon, a key to swaying the tribes that could tip the balance of the rebellion. But the risk was a blade held to her throat, for the Powhatan might see her as a traitor, a half-breed who carried the stain of the English. Kofi, too, bore a burden, his past as an Ashanti warrior, a crown he could not reclaim. Yet his presence at the gathering had ignited a spark among the rebels. They saw in him a leader, a man who had fought and survived, whose scars were a testament to a spirit unbroken. Together, Eliza and Kofi were a symbol of defiance, a union that defied the chains of colony and tribe. But the path they walked was a narrow one, edged with betrayal and blood. The estate was a powder keg, its tension a living thing that pulsed in every glance, every whispered word. Kofi bore the weight of Grayson's hatred with a quiet ferocity that both awed and frightened. Eliza. The day was a gauntlet of fear and preparation. The militia's presence was a constant threat, their patrols tighter, their voices sharp with suspicion. As night fell, the estate was cloaked in a restless hush, the rain a faint drizzle that masked their movements. At the river's split, the rebels waited, a small band of men and women, their faces marked with the scars of chains and the fire of defiance. The signal was answered, a distant fire, faint but unmistakable, blooming in the swamp's heart. The battle was chaos, a clash of steel and blood under a sky torn by lightning. Eliza and Kofi fought their way to the stockade, freeing those they could, their hands slick with blood and rain. The ashes of freedom. The Virginia night of 1712 was a tapestry of fire and shadow, its air thick with the acrid bite of smoke and the metallic temps of blood. The James River roared like a wounded beast, its swollen waters reflecting the flames that danced in the swamp. A beacon of rebellion that had sparked and now threatened to consume all it touched. Grayson's fall had been a fleeting victory, his blood a stain on the earth. The air was thick with the scent of decay and the buzz of insects, a chorus that seemed to mourn and mock in equal measure. Kofi led the way, his knife flashing in the faint light, his eyes scanning the darkness for signs of pursuit. But the militia was relentless, their lanterns cutting through the swamp like blades, their shouts growing louder. Liza's heart lurched as a musket fired, the sound a thunderclap that sent the rebels scattering. Kofi pulled her behind a tree, his body a shield, his knife ready. She knelt beside him, her hands pressing against the wound, her tears mingling with the rain. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice breaking. But Kofi's smile was a gift, a promise that their love would outlast the storm. "We are free," he said, his voice weak but resolute, and in that moment Eliza knew he spoke the truth. They had fought, they had loved, and they had carved a path through the darkness, even if it led to this. The militia closed in, their shouts a roar that drowned the river's song. But Eliza held Kofi's hand, her heart ablaze that could not be quenched. As the final blow came, she saw the lavender in her gown. It sent a faint echo of hope, and she knew that their story would live on. A spark in the ashes of a world that could not hold them. "Stay with me," he whispered, his voice a lifeline in the chaos. The river carried their story, its waters a mirror for the stars. And in the years that followed, those who dreamed of freedom spoke their names, a crown of ash that lit the way for others. The price had been paid, but the fire they had kindled could not be extinguished, a legacy that burned in the hearts of those who dared to break their chains. The others fought on, their crude weapons clashing against steel, their cries a song of defiance that echoed through the night. Eliza gripped her own knife, its weight a reminder of the fire within her. And when a militiaman lunged from the shadows, she struck, her blade finding flesh, her heart ablaze that burned away her fear. The man fell, but another took his place, and the battle became a blur of blood and rain, a desperate dance on the edge of oblivion. Eliza followed, her gown torn, her breath shallow, her heart pounding with the weight of their flight. The leader, a man named Temu, was Powhatan, his face marked with the lines of a life spent fighting. The rebels prepared for a final stand, their weapons raised, their eyes burning with a fire that refused to die. Ah! Eliza and Kofi stood together, their hands clasped, their love a flame that could not be extinguished. The battle was fierce, a clash of steel and blood under a sky torn by lightning. Lisa fought with a ferocity she had not known she possessed, her knife a song of defiance, her Powhatan blood a fire that guided her hand. Kofi was a warrior reborn, his movements swift and deadly, his scars a testament to a strength that could not be broken. But the militia was too many, their muskets a relentless tide. And one by one, the rebels fell, their cries a requiem for a dream that had burned too bright. He looked at Eliza, his gaze sharp but not unkind, and she felt the weight of her heritage like a crown of ash. "You are your mother's daughter," he said, his voice low but resonant, "but you are also theirs." He nodded to the English blood in her veins, the half-breed stain she had carried all her life. "Will you stand with us?" Eliza's heart pounded, her eyes finding Kofi's, his strength, a silent vow. "I stand with him," she said, her voice steady, with freedom. Temu nodded, and the rebels welcomed them, their fire a beacon that warmed the cold night. The other 7 souls, scarred and weary, moved with them, their steps silent, their eyes sharp with the instinct to survive. The river split was behind them now, the old oak a distant memory, its branches a silent witness to the rebellion that had burned and now flickered. "We must reach the camp," Kofi said, his voice low but steady, his hand tightening on hers. "It's our only chance," Lisa nodded, her throat tight, for the camp was a myth, a whisper of a place where the free gathered beyond the reach of chains. But the path was treacherous, and the malicious shouts echoed in the distance, a reminder that freedom was a dream that could end in blood. But the militia's numbers were too great, their muskets a relentless tide that drove the rebels back into the swamp. Eliza's mind raced, her thoughts a tangle of fear and hope. She thought of Mavis, the old woman who had given her the lavender, now likely facing the militia's wrath back at the estate. She thought of her mother, whose Powhatan blood ran in her veins, a heritage she had claimed only to find it rejected. And she thought of Kofi, the warrior who had become her heart, his strength a flame that warmed her even in this dark place. "Why do you fight?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the rain. Kofi paused, his eyes meeting hers, their depths a storm of sorrow and defiance. "For you," he said, and the words were a vow, a confession that pierced her soul. "For us, for the home we will build, even if it's only in our hearts." Eliza's breath caught, her eyes burning with tears she could not shed. For his words were a gift, a promise that their love could outlast the chains that sought to bind them. Eliza and Kofi had freed a handful of slaves, men and women, whose eyes burned with the same fire that had ignited their own hearts. But the cost was heavy. Nia, the rebel leader, had fallen, her body crumpling under a musket's fire. Her last words a call to keep the flame alive. Powhatan had not come, their absence a wound that cut deeper than any blade. For Eliza's blood, her bridge to her mother's people, had not been enough. The rebels were alone, their numbers dwindling, their path through the swamp, a desperate gamble against capture and death. Yet, as Eliza stumbled through the mud, Kofi's hand a lifeline in hers, she felt the fire within her blaze, a resolve that refused to break. The Harrow estate lay in chaos, its palisades breached, its lanterns shattered, the cries of the militia mingling with the shouts of the rebels who had dared to strike against their chains. The tobacco fields, sodden and trampled, bore witness to the battle that had raged, their leaves stained with the cost of defiance. Liza ran through the darkness, her heart a drumbeat of fear and resolve, her storm-gray eyes burning with a fire that no storm could quench. Kofi, her husband by the cruel decree of fate, was a warrior beside her, his scars a map of survival, his strength a lodestone that guided her through the chaos. Their marriage, a fragile thread woven to appease empires, had become a crown of ash, symbol of a love and rebellion that defied the world's cruelty. Now, as they fled through the swamp, their hands clasped, their breaths ragged, they carried the weight of a dream that could either free them or bury them. The battle at the stockade had been a storm of steel and blood, a desperate clash that had left the rebels battered but unbroken. The swamp was a labyrinth of shadow and peril, its waters sucking at their feet, its branches clawing at their skin. As they moved deeper into the swamp, the rain returned, a cold curtain that masked their tracks but chilled their bones. The camp was closer now, its presence a faint light in the darkness, a flicker of hope that guided their steps. They reached the camp at last, a clearing hidden deep in the swamp, where a handful of rebels, black and red, scarred and free-weighted with weapons and wary eyes. But the militia was close, their lanterns a ring of death that tightened around the camp. In the chaos, Kofi took a musket ball to the shoulder, his body crumpling. But his eyes never left Eliza's. The rebellion was crushed, the camp burned, but whispers of Eliza and Kofi spread through the colonies, a tale of love and defiance that grew with each telling. The end.